All right, now it's presentation time and go.
Yeah.
So grab your seats and your pens and pencils. Everybody get ready for I have the I have the honor of introducing one of our new members of the society. Some of you've met him. He has a complicated name, and I don't want to get it wrong. Ian Newby Clark. It's a hyphenated last name, and there's an interesting history behind the name that I won't get into. He comes to us from the University of Guelph. He's a social psychologist. He's a professor of social psychology, and he sort of stumbled onto descriptive and found some value there, you know, principally with the paradigm case formulation and some of the writings of Ray Burton. And we're going to get a paradigm case formulation today of daydreaming. Daydreaming. So would you please help me welcome Dr. Newby.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm not used to a mic, so we'll see how this goes. I will, if I want, I tend to wander, so I'll pick up the mic and wander. Hopefully I remember to do that. I do have some material to present to you, and just to give you some context, but I would also like this very much to be a bit of a workshop as well, in terms of coming up with the best possible, at least for right now, paradigm case formulation of daydreaming. I'm rather new to descriptive psychology, and this is my first paradigm case formulation, and there's no chance that I've captured everything, and so I'm very much looking forward to your input. And actually, what I'd like to do is at a later point in the presentation, I'd actually like to turn it all over to you for a few minutes to maybe do, as we say when we're teaching the undergraduates, a think, pair, and share. So a moment to think, then you pair, and then you talk to each other, and then you share that. And you can also make notes if you want, because I wrote, some months ago, I wrote as one of my learning objectives that I'd like people to be able to critique things in writing, so if you could all write, that would be good. Yeah, but anyways, let's get the show on the road. Someone once said that a lot of research is me-search, and this is definitely a case of that. I daydream a lot. I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I do, or if I'm a minority, but I tend to. And so when I was on sabbatical back in 2014, I realized that I really ought to start studying this, because I spent a good amount of time daydreaming, and I'd like to get to know more about it. And I started to read, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I started to get a flavor for the discipline, for the study of the topic matter. And then I stumbled across Ray's work and this idea of a paradigm case formulation, and it struck me that this would be a really good idea to begin to characterize what daydreaming is, and would be also, I think, an effective way to effectively divorce it conceptually from mind wandering. And I'll get to my complaints about the conflation of mind wandering and daydreaming as we move along. So I'll just give you a quick overview. I'm going to practice walking around this. Okay. Just give you a quick overview of what we're going to do today. The first thing is I'm just going to talk about the ubiquity of the term and the places where daydreaming pops up in popular culture, because it really is kind of all over the place when you start to look around, and also talk about some synonyms, of which there are many, which is, and that's supposed to say prior work. I won't let my OCD make me. I'm not going to correct it right now in front of you. I'll just let it go. This is a moment for personal growth for me. Then I'll talk about what I take to be the unfortunate conflation of daydreaming and mind wandering in the current empirical psychological literature. And I think this has led to no end of confusion. And if you're suspecting as a descriptive psychologist, hey, this might have something to do with the fact that psychologists tend to, in so-called mainstream work, tend to play fast and loose with concepts, I think you're probably right. I think that's a big part of it. But unfortunately, a lot of things have gotten lost because of this conflation. I'm going to argue that at its base, daydreaming is imagining events, which is actually the definition before I came to paradigm case formulation that I came to define daydreaming and to divorce it from mind wandering. And I have a paper that's now under revision for theory and for psychology and theory. What's it called? Anyways, it's a theoretical journal in which I'm making the case. But I think I can very much expand it. It's called Theory and Psychology. I think I can very much expand it by doing a paradigm case formulation. And I'll give you the core of the paradigm case formulation. As Joe says, if there was ever a such thing as daydreaming, this is it right here. I'll give you that. And I'll give you my proposed transformations. But then I'm very much interested in your thoughts about the transformations I'm introducing here. And then hopefully lots of time for questions as well. Okay, so on to ubiquity. First of all, the synonyms: reverie, musing, fancy, these are all that I run across in my readings. Contemplation, wool gathering, fantasy, especially with Freud, which I'll get to in a moment, and some of his intellectual descendants as well. And we also see it, it's not showing up terribly well. Emily Bronte wrote a poem called A Daydream, which I highly recommend. It's a great poem. Kind of a quasi-sonnet form. It's nice. Also, if you type in Daydream to Google, you get a lot of songs popping up, including Daydream Believer by the Monkees. It goes on, and also, of course, Love and Spoonful, right, which is not on that list, but yes, they also have a song called Daydream. So it's a ubiquitous concept in everyday language, everyday use. And also, if you want to know how to do it, you can go to WikiHow. WikiHow has everything, including how to daydream. And then I read through the instructions and I thought, no, that's not how I do it. But
Maybe you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do people get points or paid for these? I don't know. And also, there are flowers named Daydream, and this is a particular very nice flower that has the word daydreaming. And there are a number of species of flower that actually have that. Okay. Prior work. Oh, I spelled it correctly that time. How about that? Okay.
Relax now.
Yeah, it's much better. So Freud. Now, here's an interesting thing about Freud. Freud, as we know, did a lot of work on dreams. In fact, he wrote a rather thick volume, right, called The Interpretation of Dreams. He didn't, strangely, I think, he actually didn't have a lot to say about daydreams. He wrote one short paper for an educated lay audience called Creativity and Daydreaming, and that was pretty much it. And in terms of his theorizing about the function of daydreaming within his general model of psychology, of how he thought the human mind worked, he actually didn't have a lot to say about daydreaming, which I find a little bit odd. He would make passing reference to this idea that daydreams are still fulfillment of wishes, but because it's not happening when you're asleep, the manifest content is even more unrelated to the underlying impulses that generated it than you would see in a dream. And he just so it kind of felt, for Freud, it felt a little hand-wavy to me, right? Which I found kind of interesting. He does recount a couple of daydreams that did get at the character of wish fulfillment, but also are really nice examples of daydreams, including one where he characterizes a young boy who's very poor, daydreaming about marrying a woman of some station and then going to work for the father and making his way through the world, etc. So a very kind of aspirational daydream. And then he writes about his own daydream about being hidden behind a door as someone praises his thinking and work about cocaine, which of course was a really big part of his early career. So, but he didn't really do a lot of theorizing about it, but he really did capture what I think is the essence of a daydream, as I understand it, a paradigmatic case where you have this kind of short unfolding story. Then came along a fellow named Verendonck, who was a rather interesting fellow. he actually managed to get a foreword to his book on daydreaming written by Freud, in which he very much took a psychoanalytic approach. The problem with Verendonk is he seemed to be lumping a lot of things together in what he called his concatenations, including what I would consider to be mind wandering and maybe also some planning, etc. But he was very much in the psychoanalytic vein. But if anyone does a historical review of daydreaming, they'll mention this fellow who has an interesting history to do with being in World War I and losing. Imagine being in a war and having your dissertation with you and then losing it and having to start again. Like, poor guy. Okay. Then comes along a guy named Jerome S. Singer, who is still doing work. He's at Yale, and he has been doing work on what he considers to be daydreaming since the late 50s, early 60s. And this is where we see a little bit in Verendonk with his idea of concatenations and how he seems to lump a lot of things together when he talks about daydreaming. But Jerome Singer seems to use the term in a myriad of ways. So he'll use it to talk about his youth when he would get very involved in these elaborate constructions that he had in his mind of, you know, an entire baseball season of an imaginary baseball team with different players and things like that, or he would imagine himself conducting a symphony, etc. But then he'll also use that term also just to refer to passing quickly from thought to thought to thought, and he'll also use the term in some of his more experimental work where you can't even know what the participant was thinking. And you're not even getting a report from the participant about what he or she was thinking. So a lot of different uses of the term, but he's done a lot. So if you look up daydreaming, you'll come across this fellow. And he also came up with possibly one of the worst scales I've ever seen in my life. It is 130 items long, and it asks about everything from daydreaming to mind wandering to kind of loss of mental control. It passes over the whole gamut. He also thought that it would be a really good idea to assess the content of people's daydreams by peppering them with questions. Do you daydream about this? Do you daydream about this? I just do not see this as a hopeful strategy for being able to capture the richness. So for a smart guy who's done a lot of work, the scale's a bit of a non-starter for me. Then came along a fellow named Eric Klinger, who's also done a certain amount of work on daydreaming. He also shows the conceptual drift. Sometimes he talks about mind wandering as daydreaming. Sometimes he's talking about daydreams. His focus is on something that I have sympathy with here. He talks about something called current concerns, and he says that daydreams tend to reflect people's current concerns in their everyday lives, and he has some evidence to that effect. Given the strength of that proposition a priori, his evidence isn't the best actually, but nonetheless it's there, and he's done a certain amount of work on that. Then comes along James Honeycutt. Honeycutt is also in psychoanalytic tradition, and as is Verendonk. Singer has a bit of that too. Klinger has a bit of that too. James Honeycutt is interested in imagined interactions, and what he stumbled across is that a lot of daydreams of people really do involve social interactions with others, and that intrigued me and kind of led me more into the study of daydreaming in a lot of ways. Being a social psychologist, I think we are social animals, and so it makes sense that if you are constructing these fantasies that you might be thinking about interactions with others. And he has a certain amount of work on personality characteristics as it relates to imagined interactions. I don't have Ethel Person here, who some of you might know her work. She was a psychoanalyst. She wrote some rather popular books, maybe back in the 80s. She talked about the power of fantasy in people's lives, and her analysis of her clients often involved them talking about their daydreams, their fantasies. So there's a certain amount of work out there, and also there's a recent book on daydreaming by a woman named Meta Regis from New Zealand, I believe, and I have a lot of sympathy with her analysis of where the daydreaming literature has gone wrong in terms of conceptual muddiness, but then she goes on to make a strong claim about how daydreams are what she calls moody fictions, in that she characterizes daydreams is always having at its core a prominent emotional reaction to what is being imagined in the daydream. And I think that's not necessarily the best way to go at this point. I don't think we know enough about it at this point to think about it that way right now. But nonetheless, a lot of good conceptual work on her part, notwithstanding that. Okay. Oh yeah, please interrupt with questions if you have questions at any point. As Dave mentioned, I am a professor, and I will just continue to talk until someone raises their hand and says, "What?" Okay, so the thing that bugged me about the daydreaming literature was that it seemed to be two. And I saw it in the work of Singer and also sometimes Klinger as well, and others, that they seem to feel free to talk about daydreaming and mind wandering as the same kind of thing, and to use the terms interchangeably. And that just did not resonate with me on a personal level with respect to the phenomenology of it. So I think of mind wandering as as they say, a decoupling of attention from the current situation and moving from thought to thought, and kind of just flitting from thought to thought in a kind of almost like a quasi-random way. One thing reminds you of another, etc. But I think of a daydream as something that has a different character to it. It's much more story-like, and so I was quite alarmed that they felt comfortable in using these terms interchangeably. And in fact, Ned was kind enough to send me an article from the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago in which they used the term daydreaming in the title, but it was about mind wandering. And so this seems to happen a lot. Joe?
I suddenly was struck by, there may be a clue in ordinary language. We often hear the phrase daydreaming about. You don't hear the
Right.
phrase mind wandering about.
I like that. Yeah, that's yeah. I wish I written that. That's good.
What is a footnote?
Yeah. You know what? We're revising. I will footnote. Personal communication. Yeah, that's a nice way of making the distinction. So I think in the program that you have at your disposal, and it actually also appears in the paper that we're revising right now, I came up with a couple of examples. You can imagine a new assistant professor sitting at her desk, and her mind goes off task for a moment, and when she looks at she's a graduate student still, and she looks at her grungy keyboard, and she kind of just jumps from association to association, as we sometimes do. But she could also do something entirely different when her mind goes off task. She could imagine herself being an assistant professor in this pristine office. The dean is calling with an important would never answer a call from the dean. Right. So those
like to daydream about getting tenure.
Oh yeah, exactly. You daydream about tenure, exactly. A lot of daydreams, I think, do have an aspirational character to them, indeed. But this seems to be. What's my next point? Yeah. So I'll lead into this here. So then you start to get into a bit of silliness, and you start to have articles that make claims like a daydream. That's actually the title of the article is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," but they will use daydreaming and wandering interchangeably. And so now they're making the strong claim that when people are engaged in some sort of fancy of some kind, when they're engaged in off-task thought, that they're not happy. And this struck me as just plain silly. Yeah, Errol.
I think that two things strike me. One is that there's a distinction to be made between semantic versus episodic knowledge in trying to get a sense of where, because sometimes I can imagine my mind wandering and it involving an episodic event, but it's usually a factual event, like an event that happened in my own personal history.
Okay.
Whereas if it's a daydreaming, or I could imagine it being more kind of like something that hasn't happened yet, or there aren't really the conditions in place for it to happen, but if kind of as a hypothetical. So that's one possible distinction also, because a lot of times when your mind is wandering, they may be things that are not necessarily temporal, right? So it might be a more semantic thing like, well, my car is, probably not the right make and model to get to, Amarillo
Right.
from Boston.
Right.
But, on the same, and then I'm kind of going into like thinking about what problems might come up with the engine. It's different than saying last year when I went and did this, but that can be included in daydreaming. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning here, just on this point, is that I think it's worth including like daydreaming about bad or worst case scenarios. It's kind of like a hypothetical postulating process that is actually kind of adaptive in certain situations. And so you kind of like imagine what your life would be like without something that is in place, or something like that, and you can kind of use that as a tool to appreciate the things that are good in life and et cetera, and kind of preserve them.
I agree with you. And so one thing that I think will come up when we move to the paradigm case formulation is the core case, if there was ever a daydream, this is it.
Yeah.
Is the core case, is that appropriate to have? And then, because one of the transformations is going to be when things go in an undesired way. And so is it best to allow that as a transformation because it's less paradigmatic? That's something certainly to think about. But I definitely want to include undesired events. And I think that some of the functions of imagining undesired events are the kinds of functions you just mentioned. Like so there's a whole subfield of social psychology called counterfactual thought, which has to do with these kinds of mental moves that people make. But it's a little bit too granularized for me. They talk about just changing one thing one way or another and the effect that has, and I just don't think that necessarily captures the full character of what's going on. But yeah, I hope to include counterfactuals in the most general sense as well, which is I think what you're referring to. If things had turned out differently, etc. If I hadn't met my future wife, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Ian, where do you put? I'm just thinking about a lot of kids I used to work with who would be seen as daydreaming, and if you talk to them, you find out that they were worried about their parent being in a car accident, for instance.
Right.
If they were preoccupied with a certain set of events that wasn't a pleasant thing they were worried about. So worry, preoccupation.
Right. So, they very well could have been daydreaming. In fact, I couldn't find it. That's the other place that I don't know if Freud talked about it or if someone took off on something he wrote about. But there's a little known neurosis called fantasizing. They used to get talked about in psychoanalytic work. I don't know if it's talked about anymore. But this very idea that you're mentioning, that let's say that there's a latchkey kid at home, and all of a sudden, mom isn't home by the time that she usually gets home, or from my part, when I'm sitting at home waiting for my kid to get back, right? And where does my mind go? And we do tend to sometimes go into these scenarios of, well, what if he's hurt? What would that look like? When would I call the ambulance, etc. I think that if you're imagining this as an event or a set of unfolding events, I would allow that as a daydream, absolutely. Yeah, I don't.
It's not necessarily dreaming about something good.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right?
No.
You should include that thing.
I would. I think that would. I think that would really compromise the richness of it. Because again, research is research, right? And so this is really all about me. So I think there's more laughs than that. There's okay. That was a joke. So anyways, people make silly claims like this, that they're arguing that when you're daydreaming that you're unhappy. I don't know about you, but sometimes some of my better moments in my emotional life are when I'm daydreaming, especially if I'm stuck on in in a line, or if I'm, if I'm on a long flight, or if I'm at some sort, or I'm at some sort of function I don't want to be at, or what have you. Those are some of my happiest moments. They're a bit of a boost. And so when you look into it, you realize that there's absolutely no way that the authors of that study, which was published in Science, could even come close to making that claim. Like not even close. They're not distinguishing between mind wandering and daydreaming. They're getting beep reports on what people were thinking about, but they actually aren't getting reports. They're simply saying, was it something that was good or bad or not, and then how do you feel right now? And that's just silly. That's just silly. We can't really get at the richness of people's mental lives doing something like that. And I'm happy to talk about that later and about how I think I'm doing that if we have time. So then I stumbled across, before I stumbled across the school of psychology, I stumbled across this philosopher named Dorsch, and he made a distinction between what he calls focused daydreams, which I just call daydreams. I don't think you need the word focused, versus mind wandering. And he was seeing the same kinds of problems in the literature that I was seeing. That people really did seem to be using these terms interchangeably, and it's probably dangerous to do so because you'll lead yourself into making silly claims like daydreaming is not good for you. Which I think was actually the tenor of the article that Ned sent me as well, if I'm remembering. And what Dorsch pointed out is that it's possible to make a systematic distinction between daydreaming and mind wandering with respect to three things that kind of matter in terms of with respect to the way philosophers think about things. I think the way we think about things too. He made the distinction based on three dimensions: purposiveness, agency, narrative structure. So in other words, when you're daydreaming, there's some end goal state that's often involved with it in some sense. There's an agency to it, that is someone's pursuing it, and there's also a narrative structure to it often as well. I don't think this is necessarily the best way to carve things up. It's not how I've carved things up, but he's making a really good point here about the very different nature of a daydream versus mind wandering, and it's something that I picked up on in my own work. Questions about it? So I've gone on to argue that at least before I came across paradigm case formulation, that a good starting place here is to think of daydreaming as imagining events. And so I did this kind of simple-minded thing. I looked up what imagine means in the dictionary, and as a starting point at least, and it says to conceive in the mind as a thing to be performed, to form a mental image of, picture to oneself something not real or not present in the sentence, right? So just, that's what imagine means. I think we all get it, right? Imagining is calling to mind something that isn't immediately in front of you. One of the things I don't like about this particular version of the definition of imagine is I think it's far too visual, and daydreaming, although often having a primarily visual component, I don't know, when I daydream, I get dialogue a lot of the time as well, and it's imagined dialogue, and that definition really isn't kind of doing it that way, but it's certainly, I think, a good starting point. And then, but you really do need to combine it in order to distinguish from mind wandering, because mind wandering is still imagining you're imagining this thing, then this associated thing, this associated thing. You really do need to add the term event. Anything that happens or is contemplated as happening, an incident occurrence, right? So now we're getting to the idea of things unfolding over time, which really you don't get when you think of mind wandering, simply flitting from idea to idea. So that's where I decided to begin in defining daydreaming and starting to do the work of distinguishing it from mind wandering.
Are you making a distinction between things that haven't happened or things that might have happened that you're rethinking an event that happened in the past?
I think that that distinction is important, and other distinctions like it are important. Have happened, could happen, or as Errol was talking about, doing changes to things that did happen. Those are all important distinctions, and I really do want to make sure that the transformations in my paradigm case formulation captured those important distinctions, because ultimately, I should have prefaced my whole talk with this, ultimately I want to use this PCF, much like the previous presenters, as an empirical tool. I want to use those transformations to be able to categorize people's daydreams, and so I can look at, are there different emotional and other kinds of associations depending on exactly what subcategory you're in. And so those are important distinctions. I want to make sure I capture them in the PCF. Absolutely, yeah. And because I always congratulate myself for not being interested in special populations, because Ned, my N can be really high. Right? I can get people in all those cells real easy compared to other people. And actually, but I thought about going into a prison population because they have a lot of time on their hands. Right? Not that I think their daydreams should necessarily be all that representative. Also, maybe they'd be a little bit less inhibited. Maybe I could get... Well, I tell my students to do this with me. I said, because we're going after daydream content, I say to them, we'll know that we have the experimental protocol correct, and that they are accurately feeling the level of confidentiality and privacy we've given them when we start getting sex and murder, right? Like when we start getting those things, we'll know that we're getting to stuff. So we're conducting a study right now where we think we have really good practices in place to accurately assure them that their responses are confidential, and that so hopefully we'll start getting that. Otherwise, it's back to the drawing board.
Really? You think your daydreams are about sex and murder?
Mine are pristine. Mine largely involves presenting at conferences. So this is kind of an honest.
It's pretty innovation.
That's very professorial of you.
And actually, there's a social psychologist named Richard Keltner, I believe, who has managed to get at this as well, and has managed to get people to admit that they have thought about murdering people. So it is possible to get there. I'm using a technique where it's going to be a little bit of a harder road, but yeah, that's the stuff I want to get to. I'm interested in people's mental lives as they actually unfold over time, as much as that's possible to do. I'm not interested in more surface level things or things that are non-specific.
You're not interested so much in the pristine ones, right?
Well, if people have
pristine ones.
If people have pristine ones, I mean, some of them probably are pristine. Also, some of them are, I think, rather mundane. I mean, one of the things that I daydream about is I'm going into a slightly new social situation or what have you, and I just think about, well, who's going to be there and how are things going to unfold? And I think there's probably a bit of a coping mechanism to this. My dissertation was about anticipatory coping, about getting ready for things, and so I think that daydreams have that character as well. Yeah. So I think they really do run the gamut, and so I'll know that I'm getting to the stuff when I'm really across that range within each person. So.
I don't think that mind wandering is necessarily random at all.
Okay.
And I think that it can provide a starting point to see what's cooking. I don't think that things just, maybe some stuff does, but there's a lot of stuff to be mined in what comes into a person's mind,
right,
where that comes from, and also the sequence of it. Why this leads to this. Some of therapy is to put together
reassociations.
Yeah. Well, to put together also the links between this thought, seemingly random thought, and that seemingly random thought, and if you can figure out the links, then you can sort of make sense of a process that's cooking or an underlying.
Oh, I like that. Thank you. I take it back when I say random or quasi-random. Yeah, and you don't necessarily need to be a depth psychologist to think that that's the case either, right? Like it could simply be that there's something to it, not that there's something deeply to it, for this idea that you're moving from thought to thought.
Yeah, and it depends on what the thoughts on what's happening and all that. Also, I think that senses in imagination can be present or are present, or whether that there is a sensory can very well be a sensory aspect to it.
Yeah, I think, and notwithstanding not emphasizing the auditory as much, I think that daydreams can be kinesthetic as well. I occasionally have managed to get a smell, but that's hard, right? To daydream and actually get the smell of the place. But it's possible, which is interesting. I don't even know if anyone's ever looked into that actually. Poor girl, I'm
Not a problem.
Are you distinguishing daydreaming from a fantasy?
No, I'm not. I'm definitely not distinguishing a daydream from a fantasy. I want to capture all the stuff that Lori was talking about, Errol was talking about, and also what you're talking about with fantasies. I want all of that to be included. I really do want it to be at its core an imagined event, but I'm gonna layer some other stuff on for the core case. But then I really do want to capture the richness of all those variations as a daydream. Yeah.
Do you distinguish it from visualization?
Okay, you'll have to give me a little bit more on visualization to know.
Here's a paradigm case. There's a lot of professional golfers practices now, but there's one that you sort of see him doing. His name is Jason Day. He's an Australian golfer. He's a top golfer. And he'll get over his ball ready to hit, and he closes his eyes.
Right.
And he is visualizing where the ball is going to go. Visualizing the shot, exactly where it's going to land. And he does this every time.
Okay.
So he's conceiving in the mind as a thing to be performed.
I think I have to let it in. Like it's not the richest, but it's more than intention. Like an intention, you can simply have a stated intention. I'm going to put the ball in the hole. He's doing more than that.
Well, one possible way of distinguishing that you could think about is rehearsal, because there's I think some research. I don't like to refer to research that I can't identify the name of the person usually, but I've heard some recent research that you can demonstrate that people are able to practice certain things like playing an instrument by kind of going over it in their mind, or and I would imagine that with something that as technical as a golf swing, that there could be a similar kind of a rehearsal quality.
Okay. Yeah.
That just isn't what I think of as daydreaming.
Well, so that's a really important point of tension, because my motive has been to distinguish from mind wandering, and that's why I came up with the definition that I have and the transformations that I have. But yes, I have had this sense that there might be some things that are going to get popped in that I may not want in. And so one question I have for all the experienced people with descriptive psychology in the room who are more used to doing PCFs than I am is, how do you make that happen, right? So if we want to disallow the golfing case, how can we make that happen in the paradigm case formulation?
Charlie's comment made me realize that in that visualization, it's very intentional.
I wouldn't say he's dangerous.
But generally, we wander into a daydream.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. You can decide to do it.
Well,
but,
you might.
Yeah.
You might.
Yeah.
If it's a pleasurable fantasy or something like that.
Right.
So there may be some downright self-indulgence in it, shall we say.
Right.
But generally, we wander into a daydream.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Ian, the short answer to your question is you do it with your transformations.
Right.
Are we close to seeing what it is that you're going to be transforming?
Next slide, I promise. Yeah.
We gotta get to the thing, or we'll be out of time again, folks.
We let you go.
So we should cut off questions for a bit.
Okay.
You've really got.
Okay. I promise I'll talk to you afterward.
We might get some questions later at the end.
Yeah, that's
Get
cool.
going.
Yeah. But by the way, I love Dave's approach to timing. This is great. It just keeps things moving. It's good. Okay. PCF. So my PCF for daydreaming. And please take out your. It's in your program. Please take out your pens and discuss with your. I'll give you a chance to discuss with your neighbor in a second. But okay. So at its core, a future event imagined by a person in which the person behaves in the desired way with another person. This is what I think is as the quintessential case of a daydream. I think of it as being future-oriented and involving someone else and with a good outcome.
Well, I think you can also, one way that you might be able to get around the potential problem of distinguishing between good outcome daydreams and bad outcome daydreams is that the desired way would be, you could say, like an intentional, like that you could have the intention of seeing it through to the good end or seeing it through to the bad end. I'm not sure if intention is necessarily the word that I want to use in that situation, but thinking about desire in a looser kind of a way than we usually use the word, you could say that like the person wants to imagine this playing out to this end versus playing out to that end and that way you can avoid potential complications that might come up if you try to say what kind of end they want to daydream about.
Okay.
You need to tell us more about it, because we're getting back into questions again.
This is too narrow. Let me offer a paradigm case of daydreaming. A little kid daydreams about being an astronaut and going out into space.
Right.
That doesn't fit.
That's right, it doesn't. And so I think I captured that with some of the transformations. I think that daydreaming, most daydreams are of a social nature, involve future actions and involve things turning out well. And I can be wrong about that, but that's where I'm starting. I give you a sense that I don't get.
Okay, let's see some transformations.
Yeah, I will get myself into further hot water by introducing transformations. Okay, I'm changing, the first transformation is simply to change future event to past event.
Okay.
I think that's probably non-controversial. Right? You can imagine things happening in the past. As we know, there's actually no such thing as the present, so we can move past that. Okay, so there it is.
Well, not right now, there isn't.
Not anymore. A past event imagined by a person in which the person behaves in a desired way. So I'm just restating it with past event in it. And now, so that, because we could also think about someone not actually having a thought about when the event might occur or have occurred, so you can change it to an event instead. Simply have them say, in which it's simply an event imagined by a person, right? So it's not tied to a particular.
You're just deleting.
Just, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. These are very
Deleting,
simple.
yeah.
Delete. Oh, that's right. That's what we call it. That's right. Okay. Then my next move is to eliminate with another person, because not all daydreams involve, as Joe, you were saying. Now I think that with this one we might be able to include the little boy now. A future event imagined by a person which the person behaves in a desired way. So,
Okay.
whether or not we're capturing the richness of, finally getting to go to the moon and maybe getting back to Earl's point of intentionality, interesting idea, not sure. Okay, I have to go on to the next screen. So,
This is more transformation.
Go
there are
on.
more transformations.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Simply change another person to other people, because sometimes our daydreams involve other people. Or, for example, my daydreams about talking at conferences, right? Other people. Future event mentioned by a person which the person behaves in a desired way with other people. And then the various combinations and permutations thereof, past event, an event, etc. Change the person to a person. This is kind of an important one. So to be clear, I as a daydreamer am imagining an event in which it actually perhaps should be yet another person. So I'm imagining two people who aren't me. Right, that's what I'm trying to get at there. So
Trump submits his resignation.
Trump submits his resignation. Exactly, yes. So,
That's a fantasy.
which I want to include. And another thing to think about is I don't know about you, but a lot of my daydreams involve interacting with famous or infamous people. And so I don't know if that should actually be allowed in as a transformation, or if we can just kind of say, well, that's captured anyways. I don't know exactly how you make that distinction when you're doing a PCF.
Well, you might be able to see a specific person versus a non-specific person. So, getting a cheer from or person. So, getting applauded at, a concert that you're performing at by like a sort of non-specific group of people
Right.
versus getting applauded at, you know, a lecture where there's a specific group of people.
Okay, I like that. I like that distinction. And then I have changed the person to people. So a future event imagined by a person in which people behave in a desired way with another person. And you can imagine other variants, right? I'm just trying to capture all the different potential interactions you could be imagining that don't include you, Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just hold off.
Sure.
It's a different kind of transformation.
Okay.
But maybe you already got it.
Here's my last one. And this will apply to every single one that we've seen. Simply changing the desired way to an undesired way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes people daydream not about events, but about the world being different.
But the world.
Imagine how the world would be if Hillary Clinton had won the election. That's not an event, that's imagining the world.
Oh, wow.
So substitute state of affairs for event?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I wonder if that would really be a daydream
You
or a much
bet.
more intentional thinking about, which is kind of different than
It's
just.
a daydream, it's a straight, I have it.
Yeah, you know what? Well, also, again, you can,
Yes.
well, part of the specificity of the event is kind of captured there, and it makes me think about in solution-focused therapy, they use a mechanism called the miracle question, which is to get people to goal setting. So they'll say, I want you to imagine that tonight you go through your normal day, you go to sleep, and then and overnight a miracle took place, and when you woke up, things were in a more desired way. What would be the first thing that you would notice to notice that this miracle occurred? Completely leaves out what occurred or what happened. It helps people get to the goal setting part without getting caught
That's
up in this.
related to this in the miracle
Exactly.
aspect.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's a different thing.
Right.
I'm just saying, sometimes people imagine worlds,
Yeah.
Right.
not specific events.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I forget who it was, but because I've talked to so many people lately, it's been so helpful. But someone suggested to me that I actually might want to do that. I might want to change to state of affairs instead of having
Yeah.
events.
Yeah.
But
That was David's formulation.
But the problem there is state of affairs too broad, and does it compromise the narrative-like feel that I want when I'm characterizing the daydream? Because state of affairs, if I take it that can refer to
Just to
any
distinguish,
state of affairs.
you're just distinguishing from an event though. So you could pick up what he's saying by substituting state of affairs for event. In the same way you change
Oh.
it by deleting this or by
Oh, okay.
adding that. It's just another
It's
operation,
a transformation, it doesn't
Okay.
even change it.
Okay. Oh, I see.
just another operation.
TA, not event, rather than event,
Right.
or state of affairs.
Okay. Well, and I
Because
and
it's
I,
true that people fantasize about that and daydream about
They
it.
do, and I wonder if they just stop there. I wonder if they don't go into something, like, I would say, if Clinton had won the election, what would have happened? And but that's like a starting premise, and then something would have unfolded for me.
Okay, but I do two things. Sometimes I do that, and sometimes I just have a picture of the world as it would be if Clinton had won, and I don't
Yeah.
have any
Okay.
this happening or that happening. I have both kinds.
I can't do that. That's fascinating.
Sometimes it's not about the way you behave, it's just something that you're perceiving something different.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes
Yeah.
I daydream that I'm in a different place other than where I'm sitting right here. And it's not that I'm really doing anything different, it's just I'm in a different place, perceiving different things, in other words.
Right. Okay. That's a good point.
Well, can I also just add one more point, which is that if you think about identity and existing in a dramaturgical historical pattern,
Right.
then there's an extent to which if what you're imagining is you in that place, there's a presumption that there's some historical set of circumstances, even though they're not specified,
Okay.
that led to both you being you and the place being the place. So, I mean, I wonder if you wouldn't be able to tie in kind of like a presupposed like assumption of an event
Right.
into any sudden set of circumstances by kind of looking at individuals being in a historical pattern, because presumably wherever you are, you may be an adult, you may be 2 years old, you may be, at the end of your life. It could be that you are, a robot and you have no age. But that all kind of, if you're a person, it's still kind of like, depending on how you're using the term, you can find some way that has to exist in a dramaturgical pattern.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean that's what you're doing.
I'm just not sure if it's a,
Those are lots of
yeah,
requirements.
yeah.
Right.
I just don't know if it's a daydream, if there's no sense of an unfolding to it. Like some sort of narrative arc, however minimal.
Back up a step.
Huh?
What is it to talk about a daydream? You can just describe a daydream as an event, but I think you capture it better if you describe it as a state of affairs in which you drop some of the reality constraints.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how you talk about the dropping of the reality constraint, you might do that, but if you start there,
Right.
then you're not encumbered by, well, then an event has to happen within this.
Right.
An event might be one of the ways in dropping some of the sort of reality constraints that, okay, now an event will unfold.
Okay.
But it may just be a daydream about a different world. What if we all loved each other, the way the Bible said to?
Right.
What would that be like? And you imagine a world in which people go around treating each other as, God's children.
Right.
Well, that's not it's sort of an event, but it's more based on what, somebody was saying it's a different world.
Yeah.
And then you're not constrained by, you've got to have an event for it to be a daydream.
Right.
And
Because a daydream itself isn't an event. Well, again, you can describe it that way, but you get better traction and a better description. I think you describe it as a state of affairs.
Okay, that's good.
Once you've loosened up the realities.
So is it still a transformation or not?
Be transforming
Well, I think maybe-
the event just
Are you suggesting you
So
change
start with
the
that.
PCF
Start
to
with
state
that.
of
The
affairs?
PCF is, what is it that you're describing and talking about? What is it you're talking about? Talking about a daydream to begin with, you're talking about a state of affairs.
Right.
And of course, since in the real world, and therefore the world we live in, things tend to happen.
Right.
So naturally, a lot of the things we daydream about are events, but not always.
Makes
And
sense.
that's what Hap is getting at, it's not always.
Right.
Do you want to include in the big picture something like problem-solving thoughts or thought experiments? So I think like, what kind of the famous example of Einstein, he's sitting in his armchair and he's, I'm writing on a light beam and what follows from that. So seems to fit, but it seems to be not to fit in any of the transformations that I can see so far. Do you want that kind of thing included?
Yeah.
I think go back to
That's
intentional versus
Brian's comment.
non-intentional.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I think of it as not intentional.
Drop the W parameter.
Yeah.
And-
Intentional action formula. That was Brian's insight.
Yeah,
Okay.
look at the IA paradigm.
Right. No, and I've read the IA paradigm. I can't claim intimate familiarity with it, but I mean, given the prior comment about how you can move a PCF to parametric analysis,
There's a different set of parameters.
yeah.
We're talking about, Brian Bland raised this issue. If you're talking about action, the parametric formulation, it's W, K, KH, and so forth.
Right.
He's pointing out, it seems to be that in daydreaming, there's no intention. That's the difference between
Right.
planning
I
or
would disagree with that.
fantasizing. When I'm trying to solve a problem, I often work on problems while I'm running.
Right.
That ain't daydreaming.
No.
That's problem solving.
Right.
That's what Ray was saying. And the difference is, in daydreaming, no W.
I would disagree with that. I was thinking a minute ago of, so when I work with people who had sexual compulsions, like compulsive masturbation or something, I'd always say, what's your fantasy?
Right.
And what it would get you, if you all went well, was they would generate this scenario that would tell you what they were trying to accomplish. And often it was some kind of affirmation. It's okay to be sexual, it's okay to be this, it's okay to be that.
Right.
It was very much an intentional action. It had a clear W parameter. And yes,
But
if
that's
it
not
happened
happening.
to them, they didn't, well, it could happen intentionally or unintentionally.
But you asked
But it
them to
seemed
do
to
it.
have a
That's not
strong
daydreaming.
W
Or
parameter.
maybe spontaneous is the kind
Oh.
I want to get to a different voice at the back there.
Yeah, so I've been sitting here thinking about all of these different types of actions that might be different from daydreaming. And in thinking about defining the parameters, so my list is fantasies, dissociating, these worries or preoccupations, re-experiencing, which may not be a conscious process or something that somebody's choosing to do, visualization, rehearsal, hallucinations, imagination, just really thinking about creativity and how different somebody, say an artist's picture of the world could or could not be daydreaming, these thought experiments, fantasies, hallucinations, delusions, I've already said that, but distinguishing how those events are different from daydreaming could give a lot of traction in really saying what a person is doing when they are daydreaming versus other kind of similar mental activities.
Right, and I'm certainly open to not capturing everything that isn't mind wandering within the realm of daydreaming. For example, there's also planning. Not sure if that has the same.
I propose we establish a task force to work with you on it. To come up with it.
Can I also add just one other?
I nominate Pat, Tricia for starter.
Yeah. Can I also add just one other thing? Is that there are multiple implementation behaviors, or there are many examples of implementation behaviors or intentional actions that actually implement multiple levels of significance. And so by doing the same action, you can accomplish one or more things. So I wonder if it's also, there might be instances where we would say, well, that's not daydreaming. Well, actually, this part of it is daydreaming. This other part of it is planning. And this other part here is about expressing your inner desires in a safe environment or something like that.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. We're out of time?
We're very close. What, do you have anything else you want to cover?
No, because that was my last slide.
I'm sure all of you will recall that the reason we use a paradigm case is not only to be able to have a starting point, but to know where and when we start running into disagreement about whether it counts or whether that's really one of those. And we saw that enacted here rather marvelously, I think. So thank all of you for your